There was a time when moving to San Francisco felt like moving closer to the future, not just to better jobs, or better weather, or better restaurants, to the future itself. The city carried that kind of symbolic power. If you were ambitious, if you were smart, if you wanted your life to feel culturally relevant, San Francisco still had a way of making you believe that proximity mattered. The right neighborhood, the right co-working space, the right dinner reservation, the right Slack message at the right startup. It all felt connected. And for a while, that story held. But in 2026, a different kind of conversation is happening in California. Quieter, less glamorous, much more revealing. It sounds like this: I'm tired, I make decent money, and I still feel behind. I don't want to spend my entire 30s renting stress. I still want a life. I just don't know if San Francisco is the place where that life can actually happen. And that is where Sacramento enters the frame. Not as some fantasy city, not as a cooler San Francisco, not as a perfect answer. Sacramento isn't winning people over because it suddenly became the center of American prestige. It's winning people over because it feels survivable. It feels legible. It feels like a place where adulthood might still be financially difficult, but not psychologically destabilizing. That difference matters more than people admit, because this story is not really about two cities. It's about a generation trying to decide what counts as success after a decade of inflation, layoffs, housing paralysis, remote work, delayed family plans, and the slow exhaustion of performing ambition in places that no longer love you back. And when you look at the numbers in 2026, the emotional shift starts to make sense. Sacramento County added about 9,000 people from 2025 to 2026, leading California's large counties in numeric growth, while San Francisco County's population barely moved, rising about 0.1% to 845,658. Even the city of Sacramento grew 1.3%. One of the strongest gains among the state's biggest cities. So the question isn't just why young professionals are leaving San Francisco. The more interesting question is why Sacramento now feels like a serious answer to people who 10 years ago might have seen it as a compromise. The prestige map has changed for a long time. California had a pretty clear emotional hierarchy. San Francisco was aspiration. Sacramento was practicality. San Francisco was where you went to become somebody. Sacramento was where you went after you got tired, or had kids, or wanted a yard, or couldn't justify the rent anymore. That was the stereotype anyway, and stereotypes survive because they usually contain a little truth. But one of the biggest social changes of the past few years is that prestige has become less persuasive when people no longer trust the lifestyle attached to it. That's the part a lot of economic analysis misses. People don't make relocation decisions based on spreadsheets alone. They make them based on what a city is asking from them emotionally. San Francisco still offers extraordinary things: density of talent, professional energy, cultural influence, career upside. It still has industries and networks that can change a person's life, but it also asks for an unusually high tolerance for instability. Not poverty exactly, something weirder than that. A kind of high-income fragility. That's what a lot of young professionals are reacting to. They're not saying San Francisco has nothing to offer. They're saying the exchange rate no longer feels fair. When a city keeps charging you elite city prices, but the emotional experience starts to feel cramped, transactional, and constantly deferred, people begin to wonder whether they're paying for a reality or for a reputation that was built in an earlier era. And once that doubt enters, the whole map changes. Because then, Sacramento doesn't have to beat San Francisco on mystique. It only has to offer enough room for a person to stop feeling like every life decision is being made in survival mode. The money math isn't just money. On paper, the housing gap is obvious. In 2026, Zillow's search data showed an average Sacramento home value around $481,741, with average rent around $2,041. For San Francisco, Zillow showed average home value around $1,393,773 and average rent near $3,995. Different housing platforms measure slightly different things, but the emotional takeaway is hard to miss. One city still asks for something close to economic extremism, and the other asks for strain without total surrender. Redfin's 2026 market snapshot told a similar story from another angle. Sacramento homes were selling for a median price around $500,000, and even that market was labeled very competitive, with homes getting multiple offers and moving in about 19 days. San Francisco, meanwhile, was still in an entirely different pricing universe, with search results on the same Redfin market page showing median home prices around $1.7 million in 2026. But if you stop there, you miss the deeper point. This is not just about affordability. Sacramento isn't cheap in any nostalgic 2014 sense of the word. A $500,000 median sale price is not cheap. A competitive market with multiple offers is not easy. Anyone describing Sacramento as a secret bargain in 2026 is either wealthy, outdated, or selling something. What Sacramento offers is not affordability in the pure sense. It offers the possibility of participating in normal adulthood without feeling completely ridiculous. That psychological distinction matters. In San Francisco, a lot of young professionals are no longer comparing themselves to wealth. They're comparing themselves to viability. They're asking questions that are much less glamorous than "Am I crushing it?" They're asking, "Can I keep doing this for 5 more years? Can I date seriously like this? Can I have a child like this? Can I absorb a layoff like this? Can I still save if my rent goes up again? If my industry slows down, what exactly am I standing on?" Those are not status questions. Those are nervous system questions. And when a city keeps you in that state long enough, even small forms of relief start to feel profound. California itself is telling the story. The statewide backdrop in 2026 makes this even more revealing. The Legislative Analyst's Office reported that California home prices remain far above the rest of the country, with mid-tier homes around $775,000. More than double the typical mid-tier U.S. home. It also noted that incomes have not kept pace with housing costs. By 2026, only about 23% of California households would likely qualify for a mortgage on a mid-tier home, down from about 31% in 2019. Even for bottom-tier homes, qualification rates had fallen sharply. The LAO also pointed to a monthly reality that helps explain why so many people feel stuck. In March 2026, estimated rent for a 2-bedroom home in California was about $2,700, while estimated monthly ownership costs for a similar home were about $4,440. That means buying cost roughly 66% more than renting. So even people who want to do the responsible thing and buy are being told by the structure of the market itself to wait, maybe indefinitely. That is the emotional environment young professionals are living inside. Not just expensive housing, suspended adulthood. And once you understand that, Sacramento's appeal becomes less mysterious, because Sacramento doesn't have to promise ease. It only has to promise movement. Movement toward ownership. Movement toward square footage. Movement toward a calmer monthly budget. Movement toward a version of life where planning stops feeling absurd. That is powerful, especially for people in their late 20s and 30s. By that age, the seduction of pure excitement starts competing with something else, the desire to build a life that doesn't feel permanently provisional. This is also about work, but not in the old way. For years, San Francisco's costs were justified by proximity. You paid to be close to offices, close to investors, close to founders, close to networks, close to momentum. Even if your apartment was tiny, the city itself was part of your compensation. Access was the product. That logic weakened when work changed, not disappeared. Weakened. By 2026, California's labor market was still sending mixed signals. The state had added 97,200 jobs since the start of the year, even though it lost 3,300 non-farm payroll jobs in April. More importantly, the information sector lost 7,400 jobs that month, while private education and health services added 11,500. That matters because it reflects a broader shift in what feels stable. A decade ago, the fantasy career in Northern California was narrowly coded. Startup upside, tech adjacency, equity-driven acceleration. The dream was not just employment, it was liftoff. But when layoffs, hiring resets, and cost pressure become part of the atmosphere, people start weighting stability differently. Government, healthcare, education, logistics, compliance, operations, public sector consulting, and all the less cinematic forms of professional work begin to look more attractive, not because they're thrilling, but because they're durable. Sacramento fits that emotional recalibration. It doesn't dominate the national imagination, but it sits inside a region with state government, healthcare systems, universities, logistics corridors, and a less fragile relationship between identity and industry hype. That changes how a place feels to live in. Even unemployment data tells an interesting story. In April 2026, San Francisco's unemployment rate was lower than Sacramento's, 3.5% versus 4.5%. On paper, San Francisco still looks stronger, but that's exactly why this migration pattern matters. People are not only moving toward the strongest labor market, they're moving toward the place where their paycheck and their life have a more believable relationship. That is a profound shift in professional psychology. It means the center of gravity is moving from maximum opportunity to sustainable opportunity. Not forever, not for everyone, but enough to alter the map. The hidden emotion is not greed, it's relief. A lot of relocation coverage gets this wrong. It frames moves like this as optimization, better value, more space, better cost per square foot, more house for the money. And yes, all of that is real, but the emotional center of this story is not greed. It's relief. Relief from financial hyper-awareness. Relief from the way expensive cities colonize your inner life. In San Francisco, money is not just money. It is ambient information. It's in the rent, obviously, but also in the social life, the dating market, the neighborhoods, the quiet status cues, the career talk, the way free time gets organized, the way success is visually signaled. A city like that can make even high-functioning adults feel subtly evaluated all the time. Not by one person, by the atmosphere. And after a while, people don't just want lower costs. They want less surveillance, less psychological exposure. They want to stop feeling that every ordinary choice is also a class performance, a dinner out, a parking ticket, a lease renewal, a conversation about schools, a question about whether to freeze embryos, a parent visiting and asking where the grandkids are going to sleep. These things hit differently when the city around you keeps turning basic adulthood into a luxury category. Sacramento, for many young professionals, offers a less judgmental rhythm. That doesn't mean it's utopian. It means the gap between I work hard and I can imagine a future is not quite so violently wide. And that difference does something important to a person's mind. It lowers the volume. Sacramento is not winning because it's cooler. This part is important because bad analysis always becomes caricature. Young professionals are not choosing Sacramento because they think it is more culturally electric than San Francisco. Most of them do not believe that. They know what they are trading. They know Sacramento can feel hotter, flatter, slower, more car-dependent, and less theatrically alive. They know the nightlife is not the same. They know the density is different. They know the career serendipity is different. They know certain kinds of ambitions still feel more visible and more rewarded in San Francisco. That is why the move is psychologically interesting. It is not a move toward fantasy. It is a move toward tolerable imperfection. That's a mature decision, but it doesn't always feel good in the moment. Because leaving San Francisco can feel like giving something up that has nothing to do with housing. It can feel like giving up a version of yourself, the version that was still in it, still in the center, still near the ideas, still near the scene, still someone whose life looked current from the outside. And when people move to Sacramento, they often carry that tension with them. They may get the second bedroom, the parking spot, the dog, the slightly easier grocery bill, the serious relationship, the maybe home eventually, but they also have to renegotiate identity. They have to stop using urban scarcity as proof of personal ambition. They have to build a self that does not depend so much on borrowed city mythology. That's harder than people think. This is one reason some relocations look rational on paper, but emotionally messy in real life. The numbers improve faster than the ego does. Even Sacramento isn't easy anymore. And there's another reason this story matters. Sacramento is not standing still while people flee pressure elsewhere. It is absorbing that pressure. The city's housing market in 2026 was still categorized as very competitive. with a median sale price around $500,000 and homes moving relatively quickly. So when young professionals choose Sacramento, they are not stepping into some untouched middle-class refuge. They are entering a market that has already been reshaped by years of California's spillover, constrained supply, and migration from more expensive regions. That means Sacramento carries its own contradictions. For newcomers, it can feel like breathing room. For longtime locals, it can feel like one more chapter in the story of California's affordability crisis, moving inland. And both of those things can be true at once. That tension is part of what gives Sacramento its 2026 character. It is no longer just the practical capital city people used to overlook. It is also a receiving station for deferred Bay Area dreams. People arrive carrying professional identities formed elsewhere, budgets distorted by other markets, expectations about schools and restaurants and housing stock that reshape demand the moment they land. So even the city that feels like relief is under stress. That's why this migration story should not be read as a happy ending. It is better understood as a redistribution of pressure. Still, redistribution matters when you're the person trying to live inside it, because there is a meaningful difference between pressure that crushes planning and pressure that still leaves room for planning. Sacramento, for many people, remains on the second side of that line. Barely, maybe, but still. Why this hits young professionals so hard? Young professionals are at the center of this trend for a reason. This is the life stage where almost every American contradiction shows up at once. You are supposed to be ambitious, but also stable. Flexible, but also planning ahead. Adventurous, but also responsible. Career-focused, but also emotionally available. Financially literate, but also willing to live in expensive places for the opportunity. Open to children, but somehow okay with not having room for them. Ready to invest, but still renting because ownership feels mathematically absurd. This is not just stressful, it is identity fracturing, and cities intensify that fracture differently. In San Francisco, the pressure often comes from compression, space compression, time compression, financial compression, status compression. Everything matters more because everything costs more. Every mistake feels amplified. Every delay feels expensive. In Sacramento, the pressure doesn't disappear. It changes form. You may drive more. You may miss the urban electricity. You may feel less impressed with your surroundings at first. You may worry that you left too early, or that the really consequential conversations are still happening somewhere else. But you may also start sleeping better. You may find that your relationship improves when your apartment stops functioning like an argument. You may discover that having friends over no longer requires strategic furniture diplomacy. You may realize that your nervous system had adapted to chaos so thoroughly that ordinary ease feels unfamiliar at first. That is one of the hidden truths in American urban life right now. Sometimes what people call a boring city is just a city where your body is no longer being asked to absorb constant economic threat signals. And for a lot of people in 2026, that sounds less boring than sane. San Francisco is not failing. It's excluding. It's important not to flatten this into a cheap anti-San Francisco story. San Francisco is still one of the most consequential cities in America. It still produces culture, capital, ideas, technology, research, beauty, and forms of ambition that smaller cities simply cannot replicate. It remains globally important, but importance and accessibility are not the same thing. The problem is not that San Francisco stopped mattering. The problem is that for more and more professionals, it matters at a distance they can no longer afford to inhabit full-time. That is a different kind of urban crisis, not collapse, not irrelevance, exclusion. And exclusion changes how people talk about success, because eventually people stop asking, how do I make it work in San Francisco? They start asking, why am I treating this level of sacrifice as morally superior? That question has consequences. It weakens the old prestige spell. It makes second-tier, third-tier, and adjacent metros look different. It changes what people brag about. It changes what they envy. It changes what counts as a flex. A bigger apartment becomes a flex. A shorter money panic becomes a flex. A plausible down payment timeline becomes a flex. Being able to imagine children without immediately opening a budgeting app becomes a flex. That is not a small cultural shift. That is a redefinition of aspiration, and Sacramento benefits from that redefinition more than many people expected. The population numbers tell us this isn't just vibes. California's 2026 population report is useful here because it shows the state in transition, not in abstraction. California as a whole saw a slight population dip, largely because net legal international immigration fell sharply in 2025, and net domestic outmigration rose to 288,600. Without that federal migration slowdown, the state likely would have grown instead of shrinking. But inside that statewide turbulence, Sacramento stood out. Sacramento County led large counties in numeric growth. The city of Sacramento posted one of the strongest gains among California's 10 biggest cities. San Francisco, by contrast, saw only marginal population growth. That doesn't mean everyone is moving from one place to the other in a neat straight line. Migration is always more complicated than internet narratives make it sound, but it does mean the broader directional change is real enough to register in the state's own demographic story. And demographic shifts matter because they capture something more durable than trend pieces do. They show where people are willing to place their future, not just where they visit, not just where they fantasize, where they sign a lease, where they transfer payroll, where they enroll children, where they test the idea of staying. That kind of decision is more honest than branding. What people are really choosing. So what are young professionals choosing when they choose Sacramento over San Francisco in 2026? They're choosing margin, not luxury, not certainty, not even comfort necessarily. Margin. A little more money left after the rent, a little more room in the apartment, a little more patience in the relationship, a little more credibility in the idea of saving, a little more time before one setback becomes a crisis. Margin is not glamorous, but it changes everything about how a life feels, and maybe that is the most revealing part of the whole story. For a long time, professional class ambition in America was built around intensity. Bigger city, faster pace, sharper edge, higher stakes, a life that looked expensive because it was supposedly leading somewhere. But in 2026, a lot of people are quietly admitting something they might have been embarrassed to say before. They do not want their whole life to feel like a proving ground. They still want meaningful work. They still want culture. They still want momentum. They still want to feel awake inside their own life. But they also want the right to exhale. Sacramento, in all its imperfection, offers that possibility to more people than San Francisco currently can. Not because it's better in every way, because it asks less from a person who is already giving a lot. And maybe that is the real California story now. Not that ambition died, not that San Francisco is over, not that Sacramento became some miracle city. It's that a growing number of people no longer believe suffering is a convincing marker of seriousness. They are less interested in living at the symbolic center if the cost is permanent instability. Less willing to confuse stress with purpose, less willing to build an adult life entirely around the hope that one more year of sacrifice will finally make the numbers feel normal. Sometimes the most consequential cultural changes don't arrive with a manifesto. They show up in quieter decisions, a lease not renewed, a move planned in stages, a new train route memorized, a house tour on a Saturday morning. A conversation between partners that begins with, "What if we just tried Sacramento for 2 years?" And once enough people start asking that question, it stops sounding like retreat. It starts sounding like a new definition of a life worth building. If this kind of documentary is your kind of conversation, stay with this channel. We're going to keep looking at the places where money, status, and identity quietly reshape how Americans live. And I'm curious about your experience with this one. If you had to choose between living near the center of opportunity and living where your life feels more sustainable, which loss would bother you more? Not the financial answer, the emotional one.